Today, I want to talk to you about a very interesting watch. It exists both as a TAG Heuer as well as a Heuer, right in the transitioning phase between those two brands. So let's prepare this TAG Heuer Pilot's watch for takeoff. It is the reference 130206. It is from 1987 and it is called the first generation of the Pilot. My name is Jan and you're watching the Time Channel. So sometimes you hear that the fan base is divided about TAG Heuer in general, especially on YouTube. Many discard the TAG Heuer brand and their latest models completely and only focus on the vintage Heuer watches. And some might not know the Heuer origins and just know TAG Heuer since they advertised so heavily, especially in the 90s, in Formula One racing. And they have a deep motorsport heritage. So it is very interesting to see this aviation-themed watch from them, this Pilot. Even though I tend to favor the vintage Heuer watches as well, I have this TAG Heuer model from the transitioning phase when Heuer became TAG Heuer. And it is a very interesting story. So just to briefly summarize that, in 1982, Jack Heuer left the company. He had to sell it, unfortunately, during the Quartz crisis. And with Jack Heuer, one of the most prominent figures left the Heuer brand. And when TAG or Technique d'Avant-Garde took over, they generated their own line of watches. In '83, when it was still Heuer, this Pilot's watch came out. It was still branded Heuer back then. It had the logo on the dial without the tag addition. So TAG or TAG was mostly known at that time for their work on a Formula One engine together with Porsche, and that's why I have this small little model back here. So it is even more interesting that they worked on this aviation-themed watch, because that was a rare thing for Heuer and for TAG Heuer as well. They mainly focused on their motorsport heritage, but as you might know already, the Autavia from Heuer had a sort of aviation theme because it was an instrument cluster for both dashboards in the aviation and in the motorsport realm. I think this model often gets overlooked due to the fact that it was not released under the Jack Heuer administration of Heuer or TAG Heuer then, because Jack Heuer was such a prominent figure and he was responsible for the creation of the most famous models by Heuer, namely the Carrera, the Autavia or the Monaco, for example. But back to this one. As I said, it is often overlooked, but it is still a very, very special piece in the line. So let's talk a little bit about this watch more in detail. The case is 43 millimeters in diameter without the crowns, even though right now, if you look at the watch from the top, you basically cannot see the crowns because they're very shallowly incorporated in this heavily curved towards the Caseback case. And if you look at the crown and if you look at it very, very closely, you can see that it doesn't have a TAG Heuer crown, but still a Heuer crown. I'm not sure if this watch was serviced and they exchanged the crown maybe, but it would be funny if they would exchange it towards the more vintage Heuer crown. You can also see that the main crown is not in the same plane as the two chronograph pushers. And that can be explained later on when we talk about the movement of this watch. So additionally, I got some calipers to give you the lug-to-lug distance on all of my watches in the future. So in this case, it is 47 millimeters from lug to lug. I have to admit, even though I know it is an important metric, I usually don't pay attention to the lug-to-lug distance. In my case, if the watch is somewhere underneath 44 millimeters in diameter, I'm usually fine. So this dial can be easily identified as a pilot's watch, since you have all those interesting looking or complicated looking numbers around the inner and outer bezel, which probably remind you of the Breitling Navitimer, since it is the same functionality. You have a smoothly rotating bezel in both directions. The only difference to the Breitling Navitimer is that with this watch only the outer ring moves, and if you know the Breitling Navitimer, when you move the outer bezel, the moving bezel is underneath the glass at the Breitling Navitimer. This one is on the outside, and that provides you some additional water resistance. And it is also noted here on the dial directly that this pilot's watch is, well, it is 100 meters water resistant. That is quite unusual for a pilot's watch. So you have your typical little sub-dials for a chronograph. You have your 12-hour counter at 6 o'clock, your 30-minute counter at 9 o'clock, and your running seconds at 12 o'clock. This is a little bit different than the, well, I would say now usual Valjoux 7750 layout that I've shown you on quite some other watches. And of course, this is due to the fact that this is not a Valjoux 7750, but I will get into that detail later on. The hour hand and the minutes hand are both loomed, as well as those triangular indices around the dial, and they're all three of them loomed with tritium. You could also see that this is a tritium loomed watch since it has the small or very small little T's here close to the Swiss made. What I also absolutely love about this watch and watch dial is the small little magnifying cyclops that is above the date window. So usually if you know your date window magnifiers, for example, the Rolex brand, they have their magnifier right on the upper crystal of the watch. But with this one, there is actually a small little cyclops beneath the main crystal, and it is aligned on the same plane as the dial. And I think it works quite beautifully, and it doesn't distort your image of the main crystal here. So it is a nice stainless steel bracelet with your three different links here. It has a TAG Heuer branded clasp, and there are some versions of this watch that still have a Heuer clasp here. It is quite nice and feels nice on your arm, but I have to admit that this bracelet tends to pull on your arm hair, so some of your hair might get stuck in between those links, and it could be that, well, due to its neo-vintage character, that maybe the links are a little bit stretched already and thus pull on your arm hair more often than I would like to admit. It does have a closed stainless steel caseback, and you can see that this is also TAG Heuer branded here. You have your reference number up top, which is the 130206 for this particular version. So I already teased that this has an interesting movement, and it is an LW0283, which is a Lemania caliber in total. And this one mates the base caliber, which is an ETA 2892-2 with a Lemania chronograph module. And due to that modular construction, you have your chronograph pushers of the chronograph module on a different plane than your main crown, which well operates then the ETA base caliber. So depending on which version you would like of this watch, so the quartz one or the automatic one, the prices differ, of course. The quartz versions go for below 1,000 euros, and the automatic ones are a little bit more expensive, and of course also depending on the condition they are in. So I've seen some auctions that were completed at a price of roughly 1,300 euros for the automatic versions, but I've also seen auctions that went way above 2,000 euros. But I think a reasonable price is more in the lower 1,000 euro range. I got this watch at a bargain, I think, for more close to 1,000 euros, since it has those scratches on the acrylic crystal. But for me, that was no problem at all, because I knew that this watch will receive a good overhaul in the future. I bought mine at the beginning of 2020. So I think this is an odd piece, tying into the now partially forgotten aviation heritage of the brand, existing as both a Heuer and a TAG Heuer out there, as both Quartz and Automatic, sporting the calculator bezel that made other models very famous, and it is a pilot's watch that is 100 meters water resistance. An odd hybrid, you could say, but definitely a time and storyteller in that regard. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you like, follow my channel for more unusual and interesting pieces from my collection, and see you in the next one.